Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Rock Academy's Masterclass concert series. This is volume 10. If you joined me last week, I said last week was volume 10. I was off. I miscounted the episodes. We've done so many. But last week was volume 9. It was great. It was Adam and Sarah. Adam blew us away with his shredding guitar playing, but who knew? I mean, we all knew he could sing. We all knew he had all these awesome skills. It was really cool to hear his music all together. So we're looking forward to hearing more of that soon. Tonight, volume 10, we are very thrilled to have a close friend of mine and a local musician, composer, educator, and probably a lot more stuff. He and I have a tendency to only talk about music, but I don't know, we talk TV shows and other things too. But anyways, please welcome Jason Decristofaro. Thank you for being here tonight, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So we're going to check out some of your tunes tonight, and I'm going to ask you some questions about probably composition, improvisation, being creative in a time of quarantine and stuff like that. So one of the first question I wrote down, I wanted to ask you, when I think about you as a musician, because I was trying to build, write out, I was all right, well, Jason's a vibraphone player. Well, no, he's a piano player. No, well, he's a drummer. Because you've played all three of those. When I've played gigs with you, you've been all three of those. I never know what you're going to be on. How do you identify yourself, or am I maybe even short-sighting what you really do?
No, yeah, so I think I just use the term multi-instrumentalist just because it's like quicker to say. It's easier to say. No, but I mean, you pretty much nailed it. I mean, piano and percussion essentially. And so, vibraphone and drum set and percussion and piano. There's a lot of other instruments I'd like to learn, but there's only so many hours in the day. So,
yeah, exactly. Well, you want to set us up for tonight? I know that a lot of the material we're going to be checking out came out of the last few months, which I think for, again, being a creative person, trying to stay on top of, your music, your musicianship, your practice, all those things, and still collaborate with people. And, as I mentioned to you before we went on, got on here tonight, you've been steady putting out music and collaborating with other musicians. So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing maybe, and maybe setting up some of the music we're going to check out.
Sure, yeah. So obviously when the pandemic started, for me and just about every musician I know, that was it for live performances. And, for me, it seems so depressing, honestly, just to think, oh, we're in this pandemic. That means the music has to stop. And I host 2 jazz nights every week. I host one on Monday nights at One World Brewing West and one on Wednesday nights at Southern Appalachian Brewery in Hendersonville. And it's kind of a regular thing. It becomes part of routine. Like, some people have Monday night football or whatever. This is like a routine. And so it felt kind of weird to be like, well, that's all going to end now. So I thought about it and I said, how can we keep this going? And it's really amazing what we have today in terms of technology. I mean, even the options we have today, we didn't have 5 years ago even. So I've been using a combination of different techniques and technology to virtually collaborate with other musicians, where we each individually record our parts and then I put it all together to create something.
So what software, because we've done a few of our classes, these master classes, we've talked about recording at home, and we've tried to do the very thing I would say we have done the very thing you're doing, and, kind of learning new skills and, new platforms and stuff. What platforms did you end up using, and where was it a learning curve for you as a performer and as a composer to now be a producer and an editor and film, more of a film and video production kind of stuff?
It was a real steep learning curve. I am not the most tech savvy person you'll ever meet, to put it lightly. And this was something that really was for both my performing and teaching, because I also teach a jazz ensemble at Warren Wilson College. And all semester, the students and I have been working on putting together this performance, and it just felt terrible to be like, oh, well, now we can't do anything. So I've been using primarily VSDC editing software, and it's really great because it's a free download. So for any music educators tuning in who are on a budget, if you're like me and you're adjunct at a couple of colleges and you don't have hundreds and hundreds of dollars to throw down on top of the line video editing software, I really recommend VSDC. For 20 bucks, it's a free upgrade to get a lot of really cool features. If I need to do additional audio editing, what I would do is take the audio out of the video, extract it, and use Audacity, which is also a free download. And I think it's compatible with most operating systems. So really just using those two things. And in terms of the tech that was used in the recording side of it, honestly, you're looking at it right here. And, you know, it's all about setting the volume right, where to place it. I think the biggest challenge for me was just learning how to use the software, and also the video aspect of recording, because I've done a lot of work in recording studios where I'm just worried about the sound, but worrying about the angle of the camera, how everything looks together. You know, I'm not a filmmaker, right? So it's like, for me, it was a very steep learning curve, and I did have some help. A friend of mine, Connor Law, who's a bassist, plays every Monday night at One World West. He has some background in music tech. So thankfully he was able to guide me a little bit, but a lot of it was, as you said, a steep learning curve. But to your point, I think for performers and for educators like you and me, Tim, music educators, and you've had to do this too for your educational setting, I think this is the future, even after the pandemic ends. I think this is going to be a necessary skill for music teachers as well as performers.
Agreed. Yeah, it's kind of took me back to when I was first learning how to do recording at all, like playing with I had access to a 4-track reel-to-reel and a huge mixing console, like way more channels than I could ever use, but just kind of playing with that analog stuff, and then kind of coming back to it and being like, oh right, you got to know these other production skills just to kind of get your head around your art. And once I think you get to a certain point, you can bring people in and say, okay, you're an actual film editor, why don't you do this? And but just to know what to have a sense of what is needed is really good, I think, as an artist. Well, let's get into it. I want to start with the first thing I've got up in our playlist tonight is if I got this right, Snarky Larks.
Yeah, the Snarky Lark. The Snarky Lark.
Yeah, I'm going to do a better read there. The Snarky Larks. My first read was horrible.
That was good.
All right. Well, let's check this out. This is Jason Decristofaro. Who else is playing on this track with you?
Sure. So, and this is kind of cool. This is one of the benefits of this digital thing. Connor Law, the bassist I mentioned, is playing electric bass. I'm playing the piano, vibraphone, drum set, and electric piano. But here's the really cool part. One of my really good friends, Kaylin Gale, who's the flute player on this recording, lives in Switzerland. And this is a great opportunity for me to collaborate with someone who lives across an ocean. So
that's very cool. Yeah. The internet allows us there are new boundaries. Yeah. Well, let's check it out. This is the Snarky Lark. right, very nice. That was
Thank you.
The Snarky Lark by Jason Decristofaro. So I have kind of a two-part question, but it's the same question for two different things. So as a composer, I know when I first started listening to jazz and instrumental music in general, I was very, very overwhelmed because it was really hard to say like, well, how much of this was written? Are they improvising? Are they improvising all the time? Like, the structure, it feels like a song. It's, you're like, man, that's a great song and you're totally in it. But when you really try to like break down who's doing what, I remember as a young musician being overwhelmed by jazz. So as a composer, I'm kind of curious how much of this was improvised, how much did you give your musicians? But then, and then maybe a little bit on the technical side, how did you kind of piece all this together to give us that really nice final product?
No, those are great questions. I think, one of the things about jazz, and, I teach a jazz history class, and a lot of times my students will ask the same question is, how am I supposed to tell when it's like the tune and when people are improvising stuff? It all sounds cool, but what's the difference? And I think one of the interesting things is that repetition plays a key role, I think. If you're listening to jazz, for those of you out there who maybe are just getting into jazz for the first time, the structure of a jazz tune is usually going to be, you've got the melody, people solo, and then the melody returns at the end. And it's not a strict rule, but it's kind of a good rule of thumb is if there's a repetitive element in the song, maybe it's a bass line that you hear over and over again. Maybe it's a riff or a melody or a lick that one instrument is playing. That's sort of the glue or the fabric. And that sort of acts as like the template. Everything else is icing on the cake. And the last track we heard, there were only two improvised sections, at least in terms of solos, which was the vibraphone solo and then the flute solo. But everything else was written out. For this tune, I wrote everything out kind of in a grand staff, like piano sheet music, because there were very specific bass lines, chords, counter melodies, and melodies that I heard. So this one was actually more arranged than a lot of the jazz stuff I write, where it's just like, here's a melody and some chords, and do what you want with it. And that kind of ties in, I guess, to the technical side of it is putting it all together. A lot of the things I compose are at the piano. And if there's a tune that's really driven by one particular instrument, when I was doing these songs, I'd have that instrument record first. The first track was the piano, the acoustic piano track. And what I do is I'd be wearing a pair of headphones, have a click track going, record the piano part. And then actually no one else used the click track. After that, rather than following a click track to make it feel a little more organic, I just followed the piano part. The challenge of that is whoever lays down the first part has to be right with the click. So there's a little bit of, it wasn't actually usually me. Usually I'd have the bass player, whoever was playing bass or whoever was playing drum kit would be the person following that click very precisely. But for this track, I think the order was piano, drum set, electric piano, and then the bass was fourth. And then I think Kalen added the flute fifth, and I added the vibes last. So.
Okay. Cool. Well, I want to jump to, you're talking about your piano. That's where you start as a composer. I want to play Strayhorn-esque.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that a Billy Strayhorn reference?
You got it. You got it.
Okay. So those of you out there listening, if you don't know who Billy Strayhorn is, write that name down, or you can even pause this and come back and watch this later. But go look up Billy Strayhorn and just dive into that. And yeah, you've probably heard a lot of Billy Strayhorn that you credited to some other people who he wrote for. So let's check this out. This is another Jason Decristofaro original composition. This is Strayhorn-esque. Very nice.
Thank you.
Strayhorn-esque, yeah. So I want to ask you about, obviously, Billy Strayhorn's an influence. I want you to give me at least 2 more names that you would recommend young composers kind of check out to maybe inspire them.
So many names, it's hard to narrow it down to 2. I
You
only get
get
2.
2.
I
Only
get 2. I only get 2.
You can give me 1 now, and then we'll do 1 on the next break. So, well, how about this? I'll let you reflect. I'm gonna play another tune. Let's do Sand Dunes.
Cool.
I'll let you simmer on that, and we'll get back to that. All right, here's
cool.
Another original piece by Jason. This is Sand Dunes. Sand Dunes by Jason Decristofaro. So I posed a question before. Recommendations for young composers.
Okay, so the two composers, and this is very cliche, but Duke Ellington and Johann Sebastian Bach. Shocking answers, I know.
I mean, if it works, it works. Like, yeah. Ellington was. I was kind of late to, like, I knew who Duke Ellington was, and certainly like enjoyed Duke Ellington, but really didn't really dive into that vast amount of compositions that he has. One of my favorite Duke stories is that when he was on his deathbed, really in the hospital, they would collect cards that people would send him, and he would have scored stuff on the back of cards, like songs he was writing. So he was just always doing it. So that's one of the challenges I've always been given from my composition teachers, is just write, just keep writing. And do you have a discipline with your composition where you sort of, just to keep yourself sharp and to keep this process going?
Absolutely. You have to have a process, I think, and whatever that process is. I think everybody's process is different, but for me, it's just try to write as often as possible. And, some days it's difficult, life happens, work obligations, so on and so forth. But really trying to make an effort, even as just for a little bit every day, write something. Another thing I try to do is really make an effort to finish a composition, because it's very easy to start writing something and then let it sit on the shelf. It's very easy to do that. So I really force myself to try and set some sort of goal. It's always helpful if someone commissions me to write a composition, or if I have a deadline that's being placed upon me to finish it. But learning how to place those deadlines upon myself, I think, is something I had to learn early on, because otherwise you never finish anything. You just have pages and pages of unfinished sketches.
Yeah. I certainly have my fair share of notebooks of great ideas that were left sadly behind.
Same.
So one of the things that how I know you and how we met was through the Asheville jazz community. And you already talked about the two jazz jams that you did curate, I guess, until everything was, we stopped doing it. But you really managed to, and I've always, I feel like you've always brought me back into the circle of musicians here in Asheville for just random projects. And it's always like, it's like, kind of like I don't know, like a mystery grab bag with working with you. You're like, hey, I got a gig. You're like, okay, what is it going to be? Is it going to be like a soul cover band, or playing some really crazy hard charts that somebody wrote, sometimes it's in the studio, sometimes it's live. How have you stayed connected? How have you been kind of keeping all of us? I mean, I know I've been apprised of what you've been doing. So how have you really managed to do that over the last few months?
Yeah, it's harder now, because I think a big part of how musicians stay connected in the scene is all these wonderful jam sessions for jazz and other styles that happen. So how does one do that? For me, a lot of it's been, and this is kind of, I guess, the silver lining musically with the pandemic, a lot of things that went on the back burner for me, compositions that I had never pursued. For instance, Sand Dunes, the one we just heard, I wrote that piece back in 2004, never performed it, never recorded it. And it took, I guess, 16 years for me to finally do something with it, because I had the time. So in terms of, staying connected to our musicians, I think a lot of it's just, reaching out to people and just saying, hey, what's up? What are you doing? And, it's harder, obviously, because, you lose something. There's something wonderful about being able to be in the same physical space as another musician and create something spontaneously. And this, I think, is one of the challenges of the 3 recordings we just heard, 2 of them which involve different musicians, is you're not really playing with the other musician. You're playing with a recording by a musician that you have to play along with. So the spontaneity and that connection is different. And I'll be honest, it's not the same. I miss having that connection, I think, in the jam culture and those kind of things, because there's a lot of spontaneity musically that happens in those settings that you just cannot do when you're pre-recording parts and planning stuff out ahead of time. One thing I have been doing is live streams where the musicians practice social distancing. And a lot of that's just been saying, who wants to do this and seeing what happens.
Nice.
But it's been harder for sure.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's been good to have a stream of, fresh art coming into, I know, my life the last few weeks, and knowing that, hey, people are out there working, and it's encouraged me to come down into this space that, I'm, and write and make myself available for music to happen. We got a few more things I want to play tonight. There's one thing I'm curious about. I got to say, it was the thing that really I listened to multiple times. It's not very long. That's one reason, but it's just super cool. And I was kind of mesmerized by the drum part. And it's called Spoken Through Music Number 1. What's up with this little track here?
So this ties directly to what you were asking before, which is staying connected with our musicians. And I thought, okay, what's something that is conducive to this whole situation of we can't be in the same physical space? And I thought, let's make like a musical game. So the way it works is I ask a musician to record a part, and I don't give them any criteria. I'd like, as long as it's 1 to 2 minutes long, you can do literally anything you want. Just record it and send it to me. And then once they send that recording to me, I say, don't tell me a single thing about what you recorded. No verbal communication, no written communication. All the information is through the music. So Alan Hall, who's a great drummer, friend of mine, just moved into town, taught at Berkeley for years. I said, just play something, anything you want, and send it to me. And he came up with this really cool groove, this really funky groove. And I was like, man, that's cool. So I listened to it over and over. I was like, okay, what can I add to this? And I didn't tell him what I was creating either. So, I didn't know what he was going to create. He doesn't know what I'm going to create. And we just kind of, it's almost, there's an act of faith, if you will, there, right, between the musicians. And I started messing around on the electric piano and said, oh, this works. And then just put it out there and didn't really think much more about it. So.
Well, let's check it out. So this is, correct me if I got his name wrong, Alan Hall?
Yes.
And Jason playing let's say, we'll call it a chance composition that came together quite nicely.
There you go.
All right, here we go. Yeah. All right. Very nice. Thank you, Jason. This has been great. We got a little bit of time for one more.
Cool.
And this is sort of a clearly an older performance because it's a performance and not something that you guys are. I don't know. Maybe you're 6 feet apart, but this is from a. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit where this last live video is from?
Sure. So to quote Mad Max, this is from the before time.
The long ago.
The long ago. That's right. This is from, it's no longer there, unfortunately, but it's a music venue and restaurant that used to be in Brevard, called Phoenix. And this is me playing vibes, Cameron Austin playing electric bass, and Micah Thomas playing drums. And this is an original blues I wrote called Blues for Goggin, which is dedicated to Warren Goggin, who was the piano and jazz ensemble professor at Warren Wilson College for 43 years, I think. And when he retired, I ended up being lucky enough to carry the torch. So this is dedicated to him. He's a big fan of Kansas City blues. So I'm like, let me try and write something in that style.
Nice, nice. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and close this out. It's just been a pleasure having you and checking out your music. I have, as a someone who's gotten to play some of your compositions, they're like roller coaster rides, man. They always thrilling. You know you're gonna have a good time, but there's some crazy loops and spins and twists, and you're a great person to work with, and you're very gracious, and probably one of the musicians in town. Always smiles at a gig. You're always in a good place. So I know I appreciate that, and your music is great. And yeah, thanks for being here and giving some time for our little school. And those of those of you out there watching on YouTube, thank you for tuning in. We're doing this every week, Thursdays at 7. Next week we got kind of a special mystery show next week. It's going to be hosted by the Rock Academy students. So if you want to see some crazy Rock Academy students doing their own show, I have no idea what's going to be in it. So it's definitely going to be worth tuning in. Jason, thanks for being here, man. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was great.
All right. Well, we'll see everybody next week. We're going to close out. This is, I'm going to let you, what's the title for this one more time?
Sure. It's Blues for Goggin.
All right.